Hey guys, I was recently asked to do some consulting by a YouTube viewer, and it inspired this episode, which his boat is by no means a piece of junk. I actually quite like it. Too often, someone gets a hand me down sailboat or buys something because they were in the right place at the right time. Then, usually with very limited knowledge on sailboats, they set out to make it seaworthy in the boatyard before they launch it for the first time. First time for them. This wouldn't be the first time I've helped someone with this monumental task, and it probably won't be the last. So this week on Everything You Need to Know, the top 3 things that you should do before you launch an unproven sailboat that you got from your grandpa that hasn't been in the water since Blockbuster Video was a thing. So let me know if this story sounds familiar. You got bit by the sailing bug when your friend took you out once on a calm Saturday in perfect sailing conditions. This led you to YouTube to learn how to sail, which after 10 hours or so in that YouTube rabbit hole, you discovered the cruising life. After 6 months in that long rabbit hole, your little heart was hell-bent on the romantic side of this cruising life, exploring long-lost Caribbean islands with a bikini girl, sundowners with the old salts, blowing conch horns at sunset, barefoot hikes up Monument Hill, and Kenny Chesney songs playing in the background at Chat and Chill while you play beach volleyball for the first time since you were 18 years old, realizing that you just aren't as young as you used to be. This dream is real, and once it's in your head, it's very hard to think about anything else at all. But the road to a tropical paradise on your own ocean-going boat is a long one, and you'll have years worth of challenges to overcome and a lot to learn. I know this story all too well because it's actually my story. The bug bit me about 10 years ago when I read the Wind Traveler blog, which is a great blog, you should check it out, and my little heart refused to let it go, even for a second, until I finally found myself sailing into Bimini from the Great Lakes and seeing that gin clear water for the first time. It's still the most profound experience I've had in my entire life. Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to make this whole channel possible. I want to give a big shout out to this week's newest patrons. We have Craig, Dennis, and Michael. Welcome to the team. Thank you so much. So let's say you have been bitten by this bug and you've done all the research that you can. You've decided what sort of boat you want, and then you start searching. You land on something because the price is right, and while the boat itself has good ocean-going bones, it's been sitting on the hard for a while, and it comes with very little information. After buying it, you're faced with the monumental task of getting it ready for the adventures that you plan to have. So where do you even start, and in what order? What things do you have to spend top dollar on, and where should you save a little bit of money by doing it yourself? Where should you get professional help? And at this stage, most of your friends are probably saying that you need professional help. But you'll have the last laugh as they watch your sailboat adventures on YouTube from their cubicle at work in a few years. Hopefully. So without further ado, the top 3 things that you need to do before you launch that piece of junk sailboat. Number 1, and what better place to start? Most sea captains will tell you the very first rule is this: keep the water out of the boat and keep the people in the boat. With that said, before you call your buddies and fill the cooler up with beer, figuring out how to keep the water out of the boat is really your first priority. Most sailboats have what are called through hulls. These are actual holes in the boat below the waterline. You usually have one for the engine, where the engine sucks up seawater to cool itself and then it blasts the water out the exhaust. You'll have another through hull in the galley for the sink to drain, and of course one in the head for that sink to drain. Also, while you're in the head, the toilet is going to have a through hull to suck up water because marine toilets use seawater to flush usually. Some marine toilets also have set up for another through hull that they use to flush out of when you're offshore. Next, your refrigeration might have a through hull as well. Some marine fridges use seawater to cool. Your cockpit drains might be below the waterline and need their own through hulls. Then the depth and the speed transducers. The list of holes in the boat is best figured out by researching the boat first and then going to look at your actual boat. Through hulls can be easy to find sometimes, like the one close to the engine, but they can also be difficult to find. They might be hidden in lockers or even under the pre-built furniture or cabinetry, the best place to start is with the boat out of the water, looking underneath at the hull and taking note of every hole that you see. Then you climb in the boat to inspect. A through hull is basically a hole drilled through the glass hull, and then a fitting is placed through it, kind of like this one. These fittings by themselves don't require a lot of maintenance over the years because there's really not very many moving parts. Just make sure it's snug in there and it doesn't spin. There are different mounting and tightening methods, and many are mounted in some sort of sealant. I personally prefer 3M, but honestly just about anything will work. Some are even flush mounted or even glassed in. So if your through hull is tight and passes inspection, we move on to the real issue, the through hull valve, or seacock as we call it. A valve is attached directly to the through hull fitting, and it's a means of shutting off the flow of water in an emergency or just when you don't want that hole to be open. Without that valve, it would be very easy to sink the boat if a hose breaks or something. And if you've ever had a much older boat, you've undoubtedly seen a gate valve in this location. Think of the valve on your garden hose at home. Well, these were used regularly for a long time. It's widely unacceptable now. My first boat, a Chrysler 22, actually had a plastic gate valve from the factory. So in modern times, gate valves have no business being below the waterline whatsoever, and they're against code. The most common solution for a seacock then is actually a ball valve, which you'll recognize because it has a handle that turns 90 degrees. If the handle is in line with the hose, it's on. If it's perpendicular to the hose, it's off. You'll want to move the ball valve through its full range of motion to make sure it's still functional. If they haven't been moved in years, they can seize up, which is really bad news, especially in an emergency. If the valve looks in any way questionable, change it right now. It'll be a lot harder to change it later. Also, remove the hose from the valve and look down the tube with a flashlight to inspect the ball valve itself and see how it works. Clean it, remove any debris, and give the whole assembly a good shake to make sure it's tight and it doesn't have any cracks or imperfections. While you're out sailing, you can be darn sure something is going to bang into this thing and it could snap off. So it's better if it's going to snap off right now while the boat is not in the water. As an honest suggestion, and what I did on Lady K was replace every seacock right now at this point, regardless. But if you think it's good, the decision is yours to make. Next, check the hoses attached to each through hull and take note of where they go and what they're for. Knowing the location of your through hulls, but also getting to know what each through hull feeds, it's a great time to get to know your boat. And the better you know your boat, the better you're equipped in an emergency. Also, inspect all the hose clamps. Make sure they're in good condition. Speaking of, it's a good practice to have 2 hose clamps oriented in opposite directions on any connection below the waterline. And this also actually goes for fuel and exhaust lines too. Number 2, sticking with the keep the water out of the boat philosophy, it's time to inspect what are called stuffing boxes. Most boats will have 2 more holes in the hull. One for the drive line that goes from inside where the engine is to outside where the propeller is, and one for the rudder post. Typically, a shaft-driven inboard will go through the hull, right behind the drivetrain, almost horizontally. Something needs to be done to keep the water from coming in where the shaft goes out, but also allow the shaft to spin very quickly, thus the stuffing box. The rudder usually uses the same sort of thing, except vertical instead of horizontal. A stuffing box is typically a tube that the shaft runs through to get out of the boat, and it's stuffed with a material that makes it watertight but low friction so the shaft can still spin. Then a gland nut is employed to squish the stuffing enough to keep the water out, but not enough to cause too much friction on the shaft. This may sound scary because it's a hole in the boat and you want to do it right, but this technology, a stuffing box, really isn't very complicated once you get a look at it taken apart. And take it apart you will, because if it's been sitting on the hard for a while, it's probably no good. Usually this is as easy as backing off the gland nut, using a pick to remove all the stuffing, and then replacing it. And then you do the same thing for the rudder. This can be a big job, and it can involve using a torch if anything's seized up. So figure out what sort of stuffing box your boat uses, and then plan ahead for some new parts. On my boat, my drive doesn't actually use a shaft at all because it's a sail drive, which many newer boats are using now. This means a very large hole in the hull where the sail drive protrudes with a very expensive rubber seal, but you only have to change it every 10 years. So the first thing I did in my refit was I changed the sail drive seal. It involved dismounting the diesel engine from its perch, unbolting the transmission and sail drive assembly, slide the diesel forward, and pull the sail drive up into the boat. It could have been done in a day, maybe half a day, but I opted to take the whole sail drive transmission assembly home to change the seals in the lower end, because if you already have it out of the boat, you might as well do everything. Number 3, now that we know the boat will float, we can focus on making sure it will maneuver. Oftentimes the boatyard is going to launch you and you need to move the boat right away. This brings us to steering and propulsion. Steering is different based on each boat, but suffice it to say, get underside in what we call the coffin, under the cockpit seats but inside the hull, and figure out how your steering works. Mine is a wheel driving a chain that drives cables in a quadrant. I have to take note of the chain condition and make sure there's not very much play and it doesn't bind up anywhere. I have to look at the cable clamps for the steel cables and their position, and I have to look at play in the whole system. Have someone turn the wheel from lock to lock while you lay upside down under there with your headlamp on, and make sure everything works properly. It doesn't bind. Next, you're going to jump out of the boat and inspect the rudder itself. I first like to sound out the rudder with a plastic hammer or a plastic screwdriver handle. Think about finding a stud in drywall. You're looking for different noises. Many rudders at this point are filled with water, and I want to know how bad it is. Am I just drilling some drain holes in the bottom of the rudder? Or am I recoring the rudder? Or am I looking at replacing the entire blade? Give the rudder blade a good shake as well. You want to shake it in every direction, and you want to lift it to see if it has play. Is it going to fall off? How are the gudgeons? How is it mounted, and how is that mounting doing over time? Are the mounts in good shape? Does the rudder have any up and down play? Is the rudder tube at risk where your stuffing box is? You'll want to know everything you can about the rudder and how it's working as far as play goes beforehand, because this can become a very big project. So knowing how much work is going to be needed early on will save you a lot in the long run. Now, propulsion. This is a beast all of its own. Oftentimes it's difficult to try and run the engine when you're out of the water without some kind of water supply set up so that the impeller doesn't burn out in 20 seconds. This is assuming that you already put a new impeller in, which you should have by this point. As a minimum, if you can't find a way to run the engine while it's on the hard, that's probably okay. Just have a reasonably good dinghy, probably a rib with a 9.9, on standby to tow your boat as soon as they put it in the water. Engine problems are one of the very few things that are usually easier to troubleshoot once you're in the water as opposed to being on the hard. Remember, you've never driven this boat before. You don't know how it maneuvers, so your first experience driving it is going to be coming off the lift and driving it to its slip. And you're going to have to learn the ins and outs of the boat. Does it walk starboard or port in reverse? How quickly does it steer? How much can it do a U-turn? Can it do it on its own length or not? It's very difficult to learn how to maneuver a boat you've never driven while also fiddling with the engine to keep it running and keep the revs up and making sure that it doesn't die. If you try to move a boat with an unproven engine that you don't know how to drive in the first place, you're really setting yourself up for an accident. My personal feelings on propulsion are I would probably check the oil. If I can do a compression test dry, I would try to do that. Make sure the engine's in overall good condition, and then I would launch the boat, and I would not even try to start it. I would use a reasonably good dinghy and some help from some experienced sailors to just tow the boat to a slip, and then I would attack the engine. I probably wouldn't do very much out of the water if the engine is completely unproven. It's just better practice to do it the safe way. Use a dinghy. There are some other things that you'll want to do that would be easier out of the water, but this episode is getting kind of long, so we're probably going to wrap it up here. Obviously, you want safety items like life jackets, and it's a must to make sure you have some help on launch day as well. You don't want to get overwhelmed. Now some news from Lady K-Land. This is probably the last time you'll see this backdrop in these videos. I have some sort of exciting life changes happening, and I'm pretty stoked about it. Also, my next episode might just be from the Caribbean. That's it for this week, guys. If you like this episode, please give it a thumbs up. It helps on YouTube. And subscribe if you want to see more content. And if you want to see your boat on everything you need to know, leave it down in the comments. I do read all of them, I reply to most of them, and that's usually where I get ideas for the next episode, and that's where this idea came from. Stay safe and keep the heavy side down. I'll see you guys next week.